Hello, my name is David Humphrey. I am the director of the Office of Multicultural Access and Outreach at Indiana Wesleyan University in Marion, Indiana. My presentation for all of you will center around creating an integrative approach to the work of access and support. Before I go any further, just wanted to give you some background information about myself. On the left, you can see uh, my beautiful sons. I have four right now, and we are expecting a fifth one. He actually is due next month. My beautiful wife is up in the right-hand corner, Dominique. We've been married for 6 years. And then down here are, at the bottom right corner, are my academic credentials. I have a BA in psychology from Alabama A&M University in Huntsville, Alabama. I have a Master of Divinity from Liberty University, a MA in Educational Leadership, Higher Education Emphasis from Eastern Michigan University, and I am currently on the latter half, please pray my strength, of a PhD in Educational Studies from Ball State University. My research emphasis specifically dialogues and creates a critical race hermeneutic that seeks to reimagine contemporary notions of prejudice in order to normalize prejudice as a potential opportunity to address how to facilitate healthy identity development in African American and Latino youth in Christian higher education classrooms. So let's just jump into what we're going to talk about for a couple of minutes, maybe about 15 to 20 minutes. So I wanted to just give you a brief introduction to myself. I also want to orient you to the work my office does. And then I want to present before you my presuppositions for the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion through the lens of access and support. Then I also wanted to um, articulate specifically some issues and concerns for students of color on campuses. And then I wanted to talk about a group that is largely underserved in a lot of institutions, undetected, and that is first generation college students. So let's just start first with an orientation to what my office does. So, my office is responsible for creating and coordinating programming and initiatives that promote access and impact the success of incoming and current underrepresented and or underserved students on our campus. We are an office that essentially sits on the fringes of enrollment management and serves as a bridge between enrollment management and student support. So my office not only researches and coordinates programming and initiatives that impact access, we also create different types of initiatives that influence the success of these students. The three groups that we focus on are first generation college students, students of color, and low income students. As said before, my office accomplishes the aforementioned through investigation and as we engage in research, scholarship, as well as trends, geographical realities. We look to address issues of preparedness that are caused by various systemic and social inequities and injustices against the aforementioned groups I talked about: students of color, first generation college students, and low income students. Our whole purpose is to eradicate all barriers, all inequalities, injustices. I know that's an audacious task that hinder college access. That also, we want to address barriers that influence college preparedness in students. And we want to create initiatives and programming that equates to college graduation success on our campus. These are all the responsibilities of my office. So we have a very robust pre-college programming initiative that is run out of my office. Pre-college programming is an aspect that is sorely, actually a resource that is sorely untapped for Christian higher education institutions. I wish Christian higher education institutions, which for the most part, most of them have um, low percentages of students of color on their campuses. Pre-college programming can serve as a very strategic vehicle through which to address issues of preparedness, to gain access to historically underreached areas, but also for stronger partnerships to develop between the work of access and support. So our pre-college programming, specifically IWU Near You, takes 4 modules that are related to 4 critical areas related to college preparedness, and we attach and we filter it with elements from different divisions, and we're able to create pre-college initiatives such as an IWU Near You STEM edition, where we're able to filter and sprinkle some of the core elements that equate to success in the STEM fields. And we create initiatives, relationships with some of the local high schools and community organizations in our area. We're able to build relationships, but we're also able to impact access. So this arm of my office is not primarily responsible for enrollment. It's primarily responsible for service. It's primarily responsible for identifying and helping and empowering students and their families to overcome barriers due to lack of preparedness. Project College Going Culture is a mentoring program that we have that's attached to one of our student success cohorts inside of my office, that involves mentoring high school students. So our students in our cohorts mentor high school students. And the parent university aspect is a one time a year full day of trainings and conversations with parents that have students in middle and high school that are first generation college students. We have these students on our campus, and we're essentially having critical conversations with their parents about what are the essentials to prepare your son or daughter for success in college. So let's talk about this connection between access and support. My office sees it being very important. We see it as being very important to connect access and support. To us, they are coextensive. They are interconnected to the point where one should influence the other. It is a reciprocal relationship between access initiatives and support initiatives. If there are any enrollment management individuals listening right now, you're always talking about how the way or the quality of recruitment undoubtedly impacts the student success or the graduation rates. Well, the way that you engage students should also influence the way in which you articulate the value of your institution. Well, in our office, we see these results as interconnected. So not only do we have initiatives that impact access, but we also have initiatives that impact support at the same time. And 3 of those are, first off, the Emerging Leaders Consortium is a brand new student success cohort that is specifically for students of color, low income, and or only you have to meet one of those first generation college students who have exemplified leadership and high academic achievement and high commitment to social justice in their communities of origin. It's a really unique work that we do with them. We combine a lot of different elements into that experience. But that program helps us to create a very strong link between the access and support drivers of our institution. The Diversity Leadership Award is another cohort in which we seek to bridge the gap between access and support for the 3 aforementioned groups that we talked about. And the PhD Pathways cohort is another way. We actually are able to create a pathway between access and support because the students who are in the PhD Pathway cohort are actually mentoring high school students and engaged in research with those students. And another way that we are able to bridge the gap between access and support is that we continually have ongoing research on issues of access and equity for underrepresented and underserved students in higher education. I say both of these words because just because a student is underrepresented in higher education, it doesn't necessarily mean that they may be underserved. For example, students such as white first generation college students may have particular elements of their experience met. Where while I could argue that no student has every single one of their needs met, compositionally speaking, students could be represented on a campus, but be sorely underserved, or even vice versa. So the approach in which we take is we seek to create initiatives and programming that impact both students who are underrepresented and students who are underserved. This creates unique conversations. It's so important that when you create these types of initiatives, that you combine individuals from various divisions, from various aspects of your institution, and then create a ecological approach to the work of access and support where it is comprehensive. There are multiple voices speaking into the initiatives so that you can have a community-oriented approach to impacting access, but also impacting success. Since the office that I am tasked with leading actually oversees this specifically for students of color, low-income, first-generation college students, most of the work in which we do has implications for those students. But at the core of the work that we do are certain presuppositions about the work of diversity and inclusion. And I did not want to go further until I articulated those. So there are some presuppositions that I carry for the work of diversity and inclusion. And I felt that it was very important that we discuss these things before moving forward, because it is so crucial that you have a theological impetus for the reason and the rationales for why you carry forth the work. And for me, being an individual that is tasked with the work of diversity and inclusion on my campus, I see diversity as an intrinsic and original component of God's creation. At Genesis 1:27, Ephesians 2:10 complements these facts. And to me, the work of diversity and inclusion is something that must be seen as intrinsic and normative to the very nature of God himself. As a result, thus diversity must be viewed as normative in the campus, ethos, discourse, systems, policies, and co-curricular aims of the Christian higher education institution. Diversity, if it is something that is normative to the biblical narrative, then we must work to make it normative on our Christian campuses. The reality is, as most of our institutions, well, I won't say most, but a lot of our Christian higher education institutions do not see or do not act as if diversity and inclusion are normative aspects of their campus practices, policies, discourses, curriculum. As a result, to our students of color, the institutions, in the words of Willie James Jennings, sends messages, implicit and explicit, that they were not made for students of color in mind, first generation college students in mind. So we have to be careful. And we'll talk about that in just a second, what that looks like. But it's so important for us to see that work as normative to the very life of our institution. So the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion has to be at the foundation of Christian service, and therefore should be viewed within the ministry of reconciliation. It should be viewed within the ministry of reconciliation. And as a result, viewing diversity as normative and rooting the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the ministry of reconciliation positions the work as restorative and thus asset-based. If the work emanates from the very nature of God himself, if the work is rooted in the ministry of reconciliation, our work, the work of diversity and inclusion, becomes acts of restoration and thus asset-based. And even more so, they become infusing our campuses, positioning our campuses to become more diverse, and inclusion should be acts of spiritual formation. So, as a result of everything that I've said, Christian higher education should be a space devoid of deficit-based approaches that presume diversity, equity, and inclusion as non-normative to the very nature of God Himself, and thus additive. So, assuming the work of diversity and inclusion as additive positions the work as being deficit-based. Some examples of deficit-based approaches include deficit-infused views regarding the struggles of minority students. There is an inherent danger when we, in a sense, pathologize students of color and in a sense, engage in victim blaming for their issues. A lot of research, specifically this article that I quoted here from Harper 2009, he argues that a lot of the work for student support of students of color actually end up doing the very opposite of which they intended to do, because they spend most of their time focusing on the issues that students of color face, and no one is attaching or attacking the institutional norms, mores, policies, and discourses that impede their success. Moreover, there is not enough research out here that is looking at why the students of color who are succeeding are succeeding. If we would reorient our perspective and look at why students of color, the students of color that are being successful are succeeding, then it gives us a different perspective of how we can continue to transform our institution to be a place that values and supports all of our students. So another example is all programming related to minority groups are relegated to specific offices and or faculty or staff members. In most cases, it's just one person. That's a deficit-based approach. For example, why is our multicultural student support spaces dislocated from our student affairs divisions? That's a deficit-based approach. It makes the work of diversity and inclusion seem non-normative to the work of student affairs and student support. Let me give you another example. Why is it that we have a multicultural recruiter in our admissions offices? In a sense, I would argue that that's a form of tokenism, because in this case, we are making students of color seem exotic and non-normative to our efforts. Whereas some of our admissions offices and teams, for example, ours, has 6 or 7 different individuals on staff that are tasked with the work of admissions, right? And then if they were to have one person that was responsible for the work of recruiting students of color, it sends the wrong messages. It sends messages of, in a sense, inferiority. You have 6 recruiters that are responsible for recruiting the white students, and then you have one recruiter that is responsible for recruiting the students of color. That's a deficit-based approach. Also, the institutional capacity for the work of inclusion being reactive is a deficit-based orientation. Our efforts should be proactive and strategic. Now, the vision for the work towards an asset-based approach requires us to see the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion as an ecological framework. It requires us to consider the multiple ways in which the various facets of our campus environment interacts with and influences the student's experience. We have to continually reflect upon the various ways in which different elements of our campus interact with and influence the student's experience of difference, whether in themselves or in others. How are we encouraging identity development in all of our students? Why is it that we call our students of color diverse students and our white students white? When we do this, we engage in acts of dehumanization because we send messages to our white students that they are not as diverse as our students of color. This is counterintuitive to the work of helping to create civically minded, biblically engaged, civic and democratic leaders, Christian leaders, when we are not facilitating healthy identity development and asking questions on how we are allowing or encouraging our students to interact with and influence experiences with difference. So that's something that we must pay attention to. Moreover, An ecological framework for the work also provides a more robust view of diversity that is not just limited to racial diversity. It is so important that we create a comprehensive approach to the work that does not seduce us into only seeing racial diversity as the main area of focus. Kimberly Crenshaw created this idea called intersectionality. The idea of intersectionality says that there essentially you can see the identities as going on a path, right, on a horizon, and it is at the intersecting points of various identities that crucial issues of privilege and marginalization occur. And it is when those identities intersect that different types of oppression are revealed. For example, women of color have unique experiences that are different than men of color. And if we're not having a comprehensive conversation, if we don't have a comprehensive framework, then we're not considering the various ways in which various identities impact the experiences of students. How are our white students that are low income or that are first generation college students being served on our campuses? Are we essentially trying to bunch them into all white students? Are we essentially trying to centralize all of our white students and all of our students of color? Or are we providing sites where our students can interrogate their identity and they can wrestle with the intersectionality that exists, the rich dynamism that exists in their identity? So let me move on fast. I know I'm taking up a lot of time and I apologize, but the work, an asset-based approach to the work must incorporate narratives, experiences, and also communities of marginalized groups must be central to the discourses, policies, norms, and curricular and co-curricular aims of your institution. Strategic programming must target the affective, the emotion, the feelings, and the cognitive development of our students. And this happens through continued and greater collaboration between academic divisions and student affairs. Is there possible ways to connect activities in the classroom to some of the initiatives and learning outcomes and events that take place in student affairs? There also must be a greater utilization of narrative as counter storytelling in student affairs. The only way that we can create a truly biblically reconciled intercultural, Christian intercultural community is by providing space where students can share their stories with each other. This is the only way we can disrupt harmful spaces and instigate healthy identity development. Now, and there also must be a robust, culturally responsive training program for student affairs. I argue that the work must transcend cultural competency training. I don't have time to talk about my convictions, but competency to me denotes a sense of colonialistic ideology. Competence denotes mastery. I am not convinced, and I don't have time to talk about it in depth right now, but I am not convinced that engaging with otherness, engaging in different cultures is merely a cognitive activity. But cultural competence to me does not denote the affective combined with cognitive behaviors that are necessary to produce a sense of responsiveness to cultural nuances. But I'll save that for another day. Well, this is the last last slide right here for my asset-based approach to the work and how we go about the work out of our office. But it's so important that you work to make the narratives and experiences and communities of color central. All right. So concerns for African American students in 1992. I thought this was so unique because I wanted to show you what research said were the primary concerns for African American students in 1992. You see social and academic isolation. You see few African American faculty, staff, and administrators as role models. You see curricula that implies assimilation as the only means of success. You see cultural differences and differential socialization practices. Some of you look at these and say, man, these are the same issues that our students are articulating that they experience now. Well, let's go to the next slide and see what are some of the dominant dominant issues. Now, I don't have it on here, but the lack of faculty and staff diversity is still a primary issue. But in addition to that issue, in addition to some of those others, I felt that I should add some of these nuanced concerns into the conversation. For example, microaggressions. Microaggressions, and Yoso et al. Talks about the impact of microaggressions on Latino students, Latina and Latino students, specifically centered around language, culture, immigration status, phenotype, accent, and surname. And they experienced three types of microaggressions: interpersonal, which were more one-on-one conversations where disparaging comments were made. I had a student talk to me and tell me that she was involved in, she's a bio pre-med student, and in 10th grade, in her sophomore year, she had a professor say, "Hey, if you don't get a B in this class, you might want to consider switching your major." And that professor never said that to any of the other students except for those students of color that were in the bio pre-med major. And the student told me that it made her feel isolated, and at the end of the day, it actually motivated her to do and work hard. But at the end, she felt slighted because she felt like there were perceptions that because she was of color that she couldn't do good in the math class. The other area is cultural conflicts. There is some unique research out here that talks about how low income and students of color come from collectivist cultures. A lot of those students come from collectivist cultures, and they experience cultural conflicts because of the cultures in our institutions value individualism and competition. Because there are cultural conflicts, and because we haven't been intentional in a lot of our institutions to infuse some of the elements that would affirm the cultural community wealth of students of color and even some low-income students, we create unique sites of conflict culturally for these students, and they struggle to have to navigate our cultures because there's always strong elements of competition. There's always strong elements of collaboration. We have to be more intentional in thinking through how we can be strategic in inserting some values that are non-normative to our Eurocentric modes of education. In addition to that, of course, being one of a few, because there's not a lot of diversity on our campuses, students feel compelled to serve as representative for their race. And perceptions of racial tensions also impacts student success. In a sense, what it seems like for our students of color is our students of color are being used as a means to an end in a lot of cases to serve the needs of our white students. We are convinced of the fact that diversity increases civic and democratic thinking in our white students more than our students of color. And we sometimes create these access-oriented initiatives that get more students of color to our campus. But because we're not willing to do the hard work and shift and change our culture, our students of color are essentially just merely a means to which to accomplish particular values and particular aims in our white students. We have to do better at that. Stereotype threat is another concern for students of color. In 2016, there is a great book by Claude Steele called Whistling Vivaldi. The book is called Whistling Vivaldi, and it talks about the impact of stereotype threat on students of color as well as women. The pressure to have to overcome specific stereotypes as it relates to women in STEM fields, as it relates to students of color in academics, tremendously impacts students' ability to perform. The uniqueness of the research lies, though, in the reality that it impacts high-achieving students more than it impacts low-achieving students. So we may be shooting ourselves in the feet if we're not addressing some of the implicit biases that impact our high-achieving students from being successful. So real quick, I just want to present the reality of first generation college students to you, because this is a reality that is often overlooked. They make up nationally 1 out of every 4, so about 25% of all students enrolled in 4-year post-secondary education. On our campus, at the residential campus, first generation college students, we define a first generation college student as a student who has neither parent has graduated from a 4-year post-secondary institution. Of course, another definition is a parent a student who has a parents who've never attended. But we're a little bit more flexible in our definition. But 30% of all of our students are first generation college students. This group is arguably the most diverse segment of students. They are more likely to come from low income households. First generation college students, I have to say this, they are white, they are black, they are Latino, they are Latina, they are Asian, they are American Indian. They are very diverse. But first generation college students are 3 times more likely to be Hispanic or Latino. And if ethnic minority, they are more likely to come from a home where English is the second language spoken. But there is a paradoxical relationship which exists between the academic aspirations of first generation college students and the pressures that are related to being first in their family to go to college. So when you combine this with the prevalence of low retention and completion rates, feelings of marginalization, as well as the stigma consciousness plague, right, among underrepresented ethnic minority group, the result is negatively impacted student experiences that lead to decreased college success. Are we reflecting on the ways in which we create campus cultures that don't equate to the success of our students that are first gen? Are we being intentional? Are there particular and unique pathways through which we are able to effectively serve our first generation population of students? Are there faculty trainings that are happening? Are there new student orientation trainings? Are there trainings throughout the year that take into consideration? Are there faculty, staff, and administrators on your campus who are first generation college students who can tell their story and maybe serve as mentors or serve as support for first generation college students? It's so important that we not only get these students to our campus, but we also must take the necessary steps to support these students. So lastly, last slide, promise. So the solutions must connect the academic, personal, social, and cultural domains of the institution. It must be an ecological approach to the work, which engages and it connects all of the aspects of the institution with strategic local partnerships, which allow us to link people and resources to address the issues that affect the quality of life on and off campus. Integration of this level would cultivate a community that is high impact both educationally and culturally for all students. So thank you so much for the work. So thank you so much for your attention. As we're looking at the linkages between access and support, it is so important that we develop a comprehensive view to the work and that we resist the temptation to exist in silos. Silos are counterintuitive to creating robust pathways that impact both the access and support. So thank you so much for your time. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.